Hi students, I am Sailaja of Computer Science Department, and today in this video we are going to learn about plsql triggers. Now what are the learning objectives of this triggers? We are going to learn what a trigger is and what are its uses, how to write a trigger, what are the various types of triggers, which statement is going to fire a trigger through an example. Alright. Now what is a trigger? Triggers are stored programs which are automatically executed or fired when some event occurs. So triggers are something that automatically called. It's a named block which gets automatically called when some event happens. Now which event actually fires a trigger or calls a trigger? So the events that call a trigger are they can be DML operations, or they can be DDL operations, or they can be some database operations like logging into the server, or shutting down the database, or logging off the database, or starting up of the database. So it can be any kind of event or an action that is going to call the trigger. So where actually you're going to write a trigger, on which object we are going to write a trigger. The objects on which triggers are generally written are table, view, schema, database. So we are going to write a trigger on these objects. What are the benefits of writing a triggers? Why to write a trigger? Now see, certain times, every time you can't do everything manually, or you can't write a stored procedure and make a call to it every time. Instead, what I want to do is when I do a particular action, immediately, automatically, I want a certain block to be executed. All right, so some kind of calculations I want to make internally in the database on a particular table. So I need not write a block and call it manually or execute it manually by making a call to it, but rather I can write a block which gets called and executed automatically when an event happens. When some associated event happens, I want the block to be executed automatically. So we can do lots of things. Suppose I don't want anybody to open my database or enter into my database on odd days or at odd times. Some in on in a, sometime after 10 I want my database to, I don't want anybody to log in into my database and make any changes to my database. So I can't sit there throughout the night, and I can't keep an eye on everybody and see that nobody enters the database after 9, for suppose. All right, it's just an example that I'm giving. So what do I do is I write a block on the block. That block we call it a trigger, right? I'm going to write a trigger, and as and when somebody tries to enter into the database after 9 o'clock every day, so immediately the trigger gets fired, and it will not allow a person to enter into the database. So I can do such things with the triggers. So these are all the benefits you can get from writing a trigger, right? So this is a syntax of writing a trigger. Triggers, what actually you have to mention while doing it. The first thing is, as we have already discussed, some event has to happen to fire the trigger. What can that event be? That event can be an insert, update, or delete. You have to specify that. On which object the event has to be written. Now, is it on the whole database? Is it on the schema, or is it on a view, or is it on a table? All right, you specify the table name. On which table you want to write the trigger. All right, so we have to specify the event that fires the trigger and on which table you want to write the trigger. Now the next point that has to be specified is, you want the trigger to be fired before that event happens or after that event happens. All right, so that specification is also need to be made, and of course a name should be given. Right, when the trigger fires, what exactly the trigger you're expecting the trigger to do, we write it in the executable sub statements. All right. So these are the different, the components of the trigger. So some are mandatory, that means you have to write them compulsory, or some of them are optional, depending on the circumstances, depending on the scenario, we write them, we use them. All right. So before and after, instead of trigger is written like instead. We generally write a trigger on the table. Suppose if you're writing it on a view, that means instead of a table you're writing on a view, we use instead of keyword. So instead of keyword is used when a trigger is being written on a view. All right. Suppose I want to keep a track if that particular trigger is actually making some kind of changes or making some calculations on a table, for suppose. So you want to have the old value and with which value you are going to change. You want to have a track of both the values. Then we use referencing old and new. So you understood, in a column you're making some changes, your trigger is trying to make some change or trying to do some kind of calculations. Then you want the old value as well as the new value. So here, to keep a track of the old and new values, we use referencing. Right? Similarly, we have two different types of triggers. It can be a row level trigger or it can be a table level trigger. So for each row, what is a row level? For each row, if the trigger gets fired, for each row of the table, it becomes a row level trigger. The table level trigger means it gets fired only once on the whole table at once. You understand? Suppose I have 5 rows in the table, right? All the 5 rows, the trigger gets fired 5 times if it's a row level trigger. If it's a table level trigger, for all the 5 rows, it gets executed only once. All right. So these are the various parts of a trigger. Now we'll see an example here. Now from this example, what I want is from this trigger, rather, what I want is I don't want any of my employees to change the data on students table on Fridays. Maybe my database is in Dubai, and Dubai it's a holiday on Friday. So I don't want anybody to change any kind of modifications. It can be insertions, deletions, or updations. Any kind of modifications on a Friday. I want my database to be on a holiday on a Friday. So what I do is I create a trigger. When should it be fired? What is the event that's going to trigger fire it? It can be before, it can be, sorry, insert, update, or delete. So before actually insertions or deletions, we want to stop DML operations to be had to happen on students table. So for that I write a trigger. All right. So this is a condition. This is, what this is. This is a conversion function. This is a conversion function. And why did I give 5 here? Because Friday is 5. The number associated with Friday is 5. So whenever it is 5, that means whenever it is Friday, you want them to stop. It should raise an application error saying that no modifications allowed on Friday. So this is just a user message. You're giving a message to the user, some kind of prompt, so that you don't allow him, and you also give why actually you're not allowing him. So no modifications allowed on a Friday. All right. So when you run the trigger, so here, how do you write it? You're not calling, just go back to the previous slide. If you see what is the name of the trigger, it's student underscore trig. But if you see here, I'm not using the name of the trigger anywhere here. But how this trigger is getting called, this is the output. How the trigger is getting called? When I'm doing an update statement, yes. As soon as an update statement on which table? Students table. There is a trigger which is already written on it. There is a trigger which is already written on it, and this trigger gets fired. You can see here, update on students. So this trigger, there is a trigger named student underscore trig, which gets fired when an update statement on student happens. All right. So internally it is going to give you an error saying that no modifications allowed on a Friday. Yeah, please, easy, don't do it on a Friday. All right. So this is how you do. What we have learned from this particular video is we have learned the usage of a trigger, learned the various types of trigger, the row level trigger and table level, learned how to create a trigger, and also firing a trigger through an example. Hope you have understand what triggers are. Thank you for watching.